Today we've got a nice pork belly dish for you. This is a fairly cheap dish to make and it looks and tastes amazing, and so you can serve it at your next dinner party or stick it on your menu. So we'll start with about a tablespoon of butter on a medium heat in a pan, and then we'll just peel and roughly chop some carrots, onions and celery and add them into the pan too. And lastly we're just going to crush 5 cloves of garlic. You can leave the skin on for this, we're going to strain it out later anyway. A couple of things you'll need is 2 bay leaves and a big sprig of fresh sage. Now whilst those vegetables are browning, we'll just prep our pork belly. Now this is a fairly easy joint to work with, so don't be too intimidated by it, but there is a bit to do. So one thing is remove this flap of meat here, and then we're going to cut these bones out just underneath here. And then on this side, we're just going to remove these 4 nipples. So to remove the nipples, we're just going to get a firm grip on one of them and slide the knife just underneath, removing as little as you possibly can because you don't want to cut into the skin too much here. And we'll just repeat that for the other 3. Now we're just going to flip the pork over and just run your knife underneath this flap of meat, and you'll see as you get to the end of it, it's just held on with a bit of fat and you can pretty much just pull the rest off. Once you've taken this off, just keep it to one side because we're going to be using it later. Next up we're going to remove these rib bones, so just slide your knife just underneath them and light upwards pressure so you're not cutting into too much meat, and just keep working your way along them until you come out the other side. Now it's worth noting here that you should be able to see the bones on the cut side here. If you can't, it means that there's meat attached to them still, and it means you need to increase the upward pressure on your knife. So anyway, keep working your way through to the other end and remove them ribs from the pork belly. Now just have a look at them ribs and make sure that you have removed all of this cartilage, which is at the end of each one of those bones. It should come off with them anyway, but it's worth making sure that you do take it off. Now just check your pork belly over to make sure you have removed all the bone and cartilage, and once you're happy that you have, we're just going to trim off some of this external fat. You don't need to trim off every last bit, but any large pieces like this you do want to get rid of. And I've got another piece of fat here that I'm just going to trim up. And now the pork belly's all finished and trimmed, we're going to move back to our veg, so it should have started to soften now, and you can add in those 5 cloves of garlic. Give them a couple of minutes, then throw in your sage and your bay leaves, and you're just going to cook them for 1 more minute, and then transfer all of that into a deep roasting tin. Next up, heat a pan on high and add about a tablespoon of oil, and then we're just going to chop these ribs down so that we can fit them in the pan. And now add your ribs and that piece of meat that we saved from earlier, and we'll just sear these off for about 5 minutes or until well browned. Now we'll turn them all over and give them another 5 minutes to brown on the other side. Don't worry if your ribs aren't completely brown, they aren't flat, so they won't all have contact with the pan, but just get them as brown as you can. And once browned, you can take them out and add them to your veg in your roasting tin from earlier. And whilst your pan's still hot, you're going to put in a splash of your cider to just deglaze it, and you can pour the rest of your cider directly into the roasting tin. Now add these deglazed juices to the pan as well. Next up, you're going to place your pork into your roasting tin, making sure that it's not sat on top of any vegetables, and make sure it's nice and flat at this point too. And now I'm just going to cut these ribs up a little bit more so that I can tuck them around the outsides of my pork, making sure they're in the liquid. Pour over enough chicken stock until it comes about 3/4 of the way up the pork, wrap tightly in foil, and place in the oven for about 3 hours at 160 degrees centigrade or 320 degrees Fahrenheit. Once cooked, remove it from the oven, take off the foil, and very carefully transfer it onto a lined baking sheet. Also at this point, make sure there is no veg sitting underneath it. And now cover with another piece of baking paper, and place a large chopping board on top, and then we're going to need to weigh that down because we want to press it flat here, so as it cools down it will set into that flat shape. I'm using 2-3 kilogram weights here, but you can use lots of tins of beans or anything you have in your cupboard. And I'll place that in the fridge for about 6 hours or overnight until you're ready to cook. Now I'm just going to remove these ribs. They're going to be perfectly tender and you can save them for another meal. Just glaze them with your favourite barbecue glaze and grill. Okay, next job is to strain out all of that liquid from the vegetables, and you're going to put all the vegetables into the sieve and press all of the liquid out that you can, and that can go into the fridge with your pork to chill. And now it's the next day, so we'll take our pork out of the fridge, remove the weights, remove the chopping board, remove the baking paper, and your pork belly should now be a nice flat piece like this. And now we're just going to cut our piece of pork belly for our dish. We're going to trim off the sides. I normally keep these, trim off the skin and just use them for pulled pork. Here's 3 different ways you can cut your pork for this dish. I'm going to be using the 3 little cubes on the left. And here's our cooking liquid. Now it's been chilled, you can see that the fat has all risen to the top and set in one layer, so you can just scoop that right off. And underneath that there'll be a layer of sediment that you can also remove. And what you're left with is this jellified stock that we'll reduce down later for our sauce. But for now, just place it back in the fridge and we'll move on to our pickled cauliflower. So we're going to start by heating a saucepan on low, add in our distilled vinegar, and then here I've got some turmeric, black peppercorns and mustard seeds, and they'll go in as well. So whilst that warms up, we're just going to prep our cauliflower. So we're just going to take all the florets off and pick out 4 or 5 of the smaller ones, trim off the edge, and then get some nice thin centre cuts. And then we're just going to trim off any excess stalk. And then place them into a small container and pour over your warm pickle mix. And you want to leave these for a minimum of an hour, but longer is better. And now moving on to the cauliflower puree, you're just going to take the rest of your cauliflower and roughly chop it, and then place into a bowl, including all these small pieces because they'll brown nicely and get you a lot of roasted flavour. Add in 2 or 3 tablespoons of oil, black pepper and salt. Now toss these round to coat, pour onto a baking sheet and roast at about 200 degrees centigrade or 400 degrees Fahrenheit for about 25 minutes or until well browned. And whilst that cooks, we'll start off on the potatoes, so top and tail, cut into a rough square and then just peel round. You could also use a pastry cutter to get the circular shape. And whilst I'm prepping these, I've got a pan with some oil and butter in on a medium-high heat. So make sure these are all the same size, and then you can place them into your hot butter. And now we're going to crush a couple of cloves of garlic. Again, no need to peel these. And you can place them into a small oven-safe dish and just leave to the side for 1 minute whilst we prep our asparagus. So just cut off the tips at an angle first. And I'm just going to lightly peel the cut end of these to improve the presentation. This is completely optional. And with this remaining asparagus, I'm just going to peel it all into thin ribbons. And we'll keep that in some cold water to prevent it drying out. Anyway, back to our fondants. We're just going to add some salt and pepper to this bowl with the garlic, and then your fondants should be nicely browned by now, so you can turn them the other way up and place them in with the garlic. And then we'll just pour over enough stock until it comes about 2/3 of the way up the potatoes. And then put these in the oven at 170 degrees centigrade or 340 degrees Fahrenheit for 45 minutes to an hour or until soft. In the meantime, our cauliflower is done, so we'll add it to a large container with just a splash of stock and we can begin blending it. And we're just going to add a little bit more stock, blend it again, and then we're going to transfer it to a smaller container with tall sides. And keep adding small amounts of stock and blending until you get a smooth puree. And then we'll finish with our cream, blend that through, and then finally we'll push it through a fine sieve to remove any lumps. You could also just throw all of this in your blender. And now I'm just going to transfer that to a squeezy bottle and keep it hot. Next up we'll do some crispy sage leaves, very easy to do here. We're just going to pick some leaves and put them in some hot oil until they darken and shrivel slightly. This should only take about 30 seconds to 1 minute. Now remove from the oil and drain on paper towel. Now I'm going to start reducing the cooking liquid from my pork on high heat, and whilst that happens I'm just going to segment an orange. To do this we'll just top and tail the orange and then we'll cut off the skin following the curvature of the orange itself. And now just gently run your knife between the 2 bits of pith where the segment sits and remove each one. Now we're ready to start cooking the pork, so we've just got a pan here with some of that sage oil on medium heat, and we're going to place it skin side down for about 7 minutes or until golden brown and crispy. And now my fondants are ready, I'll just take them out and leave them somewhere warm. Once your pork skin looks like this, you can flip them over onto a side, and we're just going to cook each side for about 1 minute or until browned. Just like this. Once it's all browned, you can take them out to rest for a couple of minutes. And now just wipe that pan out, add some butter, and we're going to saute the asparagus. You don't want to cook this for any longer than a minute or it will start losing colour and texture. Once cooked, add a little bit of salt and take out to drain, And you'll notice as well I've turned my sauce off now as it is reduced to a nice thick sauce. Okay, last job now, gather all your ingredients together and let's plate.